The morning mist clung to the scarred earth like a shroud, masking the largest gathering of Canadian forces ever assembled on European soil. Private William McLeod pressed his back against the muddy trench wall, his breath visible in the cold April air of 1917. Above him, the sky rumbled with the distant thunder of artillery, a sound that had become as familiar as his own heartbeat over the past months. McLeod. Sergeant Thomas Harrison's voice cut through the din. "Check your kit again. We move at O-5-30. The young soldier from Nova Scotia nodded, his hands automatically moving to verify his rifle, bayonet, and ammunition. Round him, thousands of other Canadian soldiers were conducting the same ritual. The 4 Canadian divisions had been training for this moment for months, preparing to accomplish what British and French forces had failed to achieve in 2.5 years of bloody warfare. Vimy Ridge loomed before them in the pre-dawn darkness, its chalk cliffs honeycombed with German machine gun nests and artillery positions. The strategic importance of this 7-mile limestone escarpment could not be overstated. From its heights, German observers could direct fire across the entire WWII plain, making Allied advances nearly impossible. Previous attempts to capture the ridge had resulted in over 100,000 casualties, earning it the grim nickname the Gibraltar of the Western Front. Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Currie moved through the trenches with the measured confidence of a man who had helped plan every detail of the coming assault. The Canadian Corps, under the command of Lieutenant General Julian Byng, had spent the winter, months preparing with unprecedented thoroughness. Unlike previous attacks that relied on overwhelming force and hoped for the best, this assault would be different. The creeping barrage will move at exactly 100 yards every 3 minutes. Currie reminded his officers during a final briefing, "Stay close to it, gentlemen. Those shells are your shield." The innovation of the creeping barrage represented months of careful coordination between infantry and artillery. Canadian gunners had registered their targets with scientific precision, plotting every German position on detailed maps created from aerial reconnaissance and intelligence reports. The plan called for a wall of exploding shells to advance slowly across no man's land, the infantry following closely behind. As referenced in the official war diary of the Canadian Corps, the preliminary bombardment had begun on March 20th. With over 983 guns pounding German positions day and night, the constant shelling had not only destroyed many defensive positions, but it also served to mask the sound of Canadian tunneling operations. Deep beneath the ridge, sappers had been digging galleries and placing massive mines. Captain James MacDonald checked his watch in the growing light. Born in Toronto and trained as an engineer before the war, he now commanded a company of men who would spearhead the assault on Hill 145, the highest point on the ridge. His men had practiced their attack on a full-scale replica of the German trenches, built behind Canadian lines using intelligence gathered from deserters and aerial photographs. The sound of the barrage suddenly intensified, and McLeod felt the ground beneath his feet tremble. The final bombardment had begun. In minutes, they would go over the top into the hell of no man's land. Advancing toward an enemy that had held this ground for 3 years, the whistle's shrill cry cut through the thunderous roar of artillery at exactly O-5-30 hours on. April 9th, 1917. Private McLeod hauled himself over the parapet, his boots finding purchase on the wooden ladder rungs, slick with mud and frost. Around him, 15,000 Canadian soldiers emerged from their trenches in the first wave, their bayonets gleaming in the pale morning light. The creeping barrage moved ahead of them like a living thing, a wall of fire and steel that pulverized everything in its path. McLeod had never seen anything like it. The carefully orchestrated symphony of destruction advanced at exactly the pace they had practiced, allowing the infantry to follow just 50 yards behind the exploding shells. German machine gunners, those who had survived the preliminary bombardment, found themselves unable to establish effective fields of fire with the barrage so close to the advancing Canadians. Sergeant Harrison led his section across the shell-torn ground, navigating by compass and watch. The thick snow that had begun falling at dawn provided unexpected cover, reducing visibility and making it difficult for German observers to coordinate defensive fire. The white flakes mixed with the black smoke of explosions, creating an otherworldly landscape that seemed to belong more to nightmare than reality. "Keep moving," Harrison shouted over the din. "Don't bunch up." The 1st Canadian Division, attacking on the right flank, made remarkable progress against the German Reserve Division. The months of preparation showed in every movement. Unlike the chaotic rushes that had characterized earlier battles, this advance proceeded with methodical precision. Each platoon knew its objective, each man understood his role. Lieutenant Colonel Curry's battalion encountered their first serious resistance at the German front line. The enemy trenches, which had seemed so formidable from a distance, proved to be less intact than anticipated. The sustained bombardment had collapsed many sections, burying defenders and destroying communication lines. Those Germans who remained, alive and willing to fight, found themselves isolated and overwhelmed by the coordinated Canadian assault. Private Robert Chen, Chinese-Canadian soldier from Vancouver, was among the first to reach the German wire. The artillery had done its work well here too. The massive entanglements of barbed wire that had stopped so many previous attacks lay twisted and broken, creating clear paths for the advancing infantry. Chen's section moved through the gaps, their Lewis guns providing covering fire for the riflemen. On the left flank, the 4th Canadian Division faced the most challenging terrain. Hill 145, their primary objective, rose steeply from the surrounding ground, slopes defended by determined elements of the German 1st Bavarian Reserve Division. Captain MacDonald's company advanced up the treacherous incline, using shell craters for cover as they closed with the enemy positions. The German defenders, many of them veteran troops who had held this ground since 1914, fought with desperate courage. Machine gun nests carved into the chalk cliffs spat death at the advancing Canadians. Artillery fire from positions further back on the ridge sought to break up the attack. But the combination of the creeping barrage and the Canadians' superior training began to tell, as documented in the London Times, correspondents dispatched from the front. The Canadian advance maintained its momentum despite fierce resistance. The reporter noted the extraordinary discipline and coordination displayed by the colonial troops, commenting that their attack proceeded with the precision of a peacetime maneuver. By 0700 hours, the 1st Canadian patrols had reached the German second line. The speed of their advance had caught the defenders off guard. Communication lines severed by the bombardment prevented German commanders from coordinating an effective response. Reserve units that might have mounted counterattacks found themselves isolated and unable to determine where they were most needed. McLeod's section consolidated their position in a captured German trench, amazed to find themselves ahead of schedule. The elaborate defensive system that had seemed so impregnable from their own trenches revealed itself to be a collection of separate strong points, each vulnerable when isolated from the others. The morning sun struggled through the snow and smoke. As the second wave of Canadian infantry moved forward at 0800 hours, the success of the initial assault had created opportunities that Lieutenant General Byng was quick to exploit. Fresh battalions leapfrogged through the positions secured by the first wave, maintaining the momentum of the attack toward the ridge's commanding heights. Captain MacDonald's company had fought their way halfway up Hill 145. When they encountered the German strong point known as the Pimple, this fortified position carved deep into the chalk cliff housed machine guns and artillery observation posts that commanded the entire northern approach to the ridge. The German defenders, members of the elite Bavarian Reserve Regiment, had survived the preliminary bombardment in their deep bunkers and now emerged to contest every yard of ground. "We need to flank them," MacDonald told his platoon commanders during a brief conference in a shell crater. "Direct assault will be suicide." The tactical flexibility that had become a hallmark of Canadian forces showed itself here. Rather than simply throwing men at the strong point, MacDonald's company divided into 3 groups. While one platoon provided covering fire, the other 2 worked their way around the flanks of the position. Using the broken ground and lingering smoke for concealment, Private Chen found himself crawling through a communication trench that the bombardment had partially collapsed. The confined space reeked of cordite and worse things, but it provided a covered approach to the rear of the German position. His section emerged just as the defenders were concentrating their fire on the frontal attack, catching them completely by surprise. The fighting in the confined space of the bunker was brutal and personal. Bayonets, grenades, and rifle butts decided the outcome in minutes of savage combat. When the smoke cleared, the Pimple was in Canadian hands, its commanding view of the battlefield now serving the attackers rather than the defenders. Meanwhile, the 2nd and 3rd Canadian Divisions were making equally impressive progress against the German center. The village of Thielis, which had anchored the German line, fell to the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry after fierce street fighting. The rapid advance had prevented German engineers from destroying the village's strategic buildings, providing the Canadians with ready-made observation posts and communication centers. Sergeant Harrison's section had pushed beyond the German 2nd line and was now approaching the reverse slope of the ridge. The ground here was less scarred by shell fire, and they could see German reserve units attempting to organize a counterattack. The enemy soldiers moved with the desperation of men who knew their carefully prepared positions were collapsing around them. Machine gun. 2 o'clock. Harrison shouted, and his men immediately took cover. The German Maxim gun, positioned in a camouflaged pit, swept the open ground with deadly efficiency. But the Canadians had trained for this exact situation. While half the section provided covering fire, the other half worked their way around the flank, using the same tactics that had proven successful throughout the morning. As noted in the official history of the Canadian Expeditionary Force, the success at Vimy Ridge stemmed largely from the thorough training and preparation undertaken during the winter months. Unlike previous battles where soldiers had been expected to adapt to changing conditions on the battlefield, the Canadians had rehearsed their assault on detailed replicas of the German positions, allowing them to respond instinctively to enemy resistance. Private McLeod found himself in a captured German command post, amazed at the sophistication of the enemy's defensive preparations. Maps covered the walls, showing fields of fire and pre-registered artillery targets. Communication. Equipment lay abandoned, testimony to the speed of the Canadian advance. The elaborate planning that had gone into defending the ridge was now working against its creators. By 1100 hours, Canadian forces had penetrated deeper into the German lines than any previous attack had achieved. The ridge's commanding heights, which had seemed so impregnable just hours before, were now within reach. But the Germans were not finished. Fresh reserves were moving up from the rear, and the most difficult fighting still lay ahead. The assault on the ridge's highest points began at noon, with the 4th Canadian Division leading the attack against Hill 145 and the notorious strongpoint known as the Pimple. The German defenders, recognizing that the loss of these commanding heights would make their entire position untenable, fought with the desperation of men who knew they were making their last stand. Colonel Victor Odlum's 78th Battalion faced the steepest climb up the northern face of the ridge. The chalk cliffs here rose almost vertically, honeycombed with machine gun nests and connected by deep tunnels that had allowed German defenders to survive the massive bombardment. Each cave mouth represented a potential death trap, requiring careful coordination between infantry and the remaining artillery support. "We go up together, or not at all," Odlum told his company commanders. The colonel, a newspaper publisher from British Columbia in peacetime, had proven himself one of the most capable battlefield commanders in the Canadian Corps. His men trusted him implicitly, knowing that he would never ask them to take risks he wouldn't share. The climb began under covering fire from Canadian artillery, but the steep terrain made close support impossible. The infantry would have to rely on their own weapons and courage. Private McLeod found himself scaling the chalk face with his section, using ropes and improvised handholds to ascend the treacherous slope. German grenades exploded around them, sending deadly fragments ricocheting off the rock walls. "Watch for the wire," Sergeant Harrison called out. The Germans had strung barbed wire across the climbing routes, creating nearly invisible obstacles that could entangle and kill unwary soldiers. The Canadians had prepared for this too, carrying wire cutters and grappling hooks to clear their path. Captain MacDonald's company, attacking from the eastern approach, made better progress across the more gradual slope. But they faced a different challenge, a complex of interconnected trenches and bunkers that required methodical clearing. Position had to be approached individually, with grenades and rifle fire used to neutralize defenders before the infantry could close with bayonets. The fighting was intensely personal at such close quarters. MacDonald himself engaged in hand-to-hand combat with a German officer, their struggle ending only when Private Chen intervened with his bayonet. The captain nodded his thanks and pressed forward, knowing that hesitation now would cost lives, as recorded in the war diary of the 4th Canadian Division. The assault on Hill 145 represented some of the most difficult fighting of the entire battle. The German defenders, many of them Bavarian mountain troops with extensive experience in alpine warfare, used every advantage the terrain provided. Hidden passages allowed them to appear behind Canadian positions, while pre-positioned ammunition dumps ensured they could maintain their fire even when cut off from their main lines. The breakthrough came when Lieutenant Harold Brown's platoon discovered a main tunnel entrance that the bombardment had failed to collapse. Rather than attempting to clear the extensive underground complex, Brown made a crucial decision. His men blocked the tunnel mouth with debris and explosives, trapping the German defenders underground and eliminating their ability to reinforce the surface positions. With the tunnel system neutralized, the Canadian advance accelerated. By 1400 hours, advance elements of the 4th Division had reached the summit of Hill 145. The view from the ridge's highest point revealed the full extent of their achievement. German defensive positions that had seemed so formidable from below were now visible as a series of separate strongpoints, many of them already abandoned by their defenders. Private McLeod stood at the summit, hardly believing what they had accomplished. The ridge that had defied capture for 3 years now flew the Canadian flag. Round him, his comrades were consolidating their positions, knowing that German counterattacks would inevitably follow. But for this moment, the impossible had become reality. The German army was in full retreat from the ridge, their carefully prepared defensive lines collapsing under the weight of the Canadian assault. Artillery pieces were being abandoned, ammunition dumps destroyed, and communication equipment left behind in the hasty withdrawal. The Gibraltar of the Western Front had fallen to colonial troops in a single day. The euphoria of reaching the summit quickly gave way to the grim reality of defensive warfare. German artillery, repositioned on the reverse slope of the ridge, began a systematic bombardment of the newly captured positions. The same chalk cliffs that had protected the German defenders now provided cover for the Canadians. But the enemy's intimate knowledge of the terrain made their fire devastatingly accurate. Major William Pearce, commanding the consolidated remnants of 3 companies atop Hill 145, surveyed his defensive positions with growing concern. The rapid advance had scattered his force across a wide front, and ammunition was running dangerously low. The supply lines that had functioned so well during the assault now faced the challenge of crossing the shell-torn battlefield under constant enemy fire. "We need runners to headquarters," Pearce told his surviving officers. "Without reinforcement and resupply, we won't hold through the night." The German counterattack began at 1500 hours, spearheaded by elements of the 11th Bavarian Infantry Regiment. These were not the demoralized defenders who had fled the ridge earlier, but fresh troops drawn from the strategic reserve. They advanced with the same methodical precision that had characterized the Canadian assault, using the broken ground and persistent snow squalls for concealment. Sergeant Harrison's section, now reduced to 8 men, occupied a shell crater on the northwestern slope. They had an excellent view of the approaching enemy, but precious little ammunition to stop them. Each shot had to count, each target carefully selected. The Lewis gun crew, led by Private Chen, waited until the German skirmishers were within 200 yards before opening fire. The battle for the ridge's summit became a series of desperate small unit actions. German stormtroopers, infiltrating through the maze of trenches and shell craters, engaged Canadian defenders in bitter close-quarters combat. The outcome often depended on individual courage and the intimate knowledge of the terrain that both sides had gained through months of preparation. Captain MacDonald found himself commanding a mixed force of infantry, engineers, and even a few Artillerymen, whose guns had been overrun during the advance. Traditional unit boundaries had broken down under the stress of combat, replaced by the simple necessity of holding ground against determined enemy assault. His improvised command post, established in a captured German bunker, became the nerve, center for the defense of the entire northern sector. The German artillery intensified its bombardment as the afternoon wore on, seeking to isolate the Canadian positions from their supporting units. Communication lines laboriously strung across no man's land during the advance were systematically destroyed. Wireless sets, still experimental technology in 1917, proved unreliable in the electromagnetic chaos of the battlefield. As documented in the regimental history of the Royal Canadian Regiment, the afternoon of April 9th represented a crucial test of Canadian resolve. The rapid success of the morning assault had created a salient that extended deep into German-held territory. But maintaining that salient required constant vigilance and sacrifice. Individual acts of heroism became the norm rather than the exception. Private McLeod found himself carrying messages between isolated positions, dodging shells and sniper fire as he crossed the exposed ground. The young soldier from Nova Scotia had discovered reserves of courage he never knew he possessed, driven by loyalty to his comrades and the knowledge that retreat would mean abandoning wounded men to enemy hands. The weeks following the Battle of Vimy Ridge transformed the Canadian Corps from a colonial auxiliary force into the British Empire's most reliable shock troops. The tactical innovations pioneered during the assault, the creeping barrage detailed, reconnaissance and thorough preparation became the model for future Allied offensives. General Byng's promotion to command the Third Army was widely seen as recognition of the Canadian achievement. Private McLeod, covered from his wounds, found himself promoted to corporal and assigned to train new recruits arriving from Canada. The young fisherman who had trembled in the trenches before the assault now possessed the quiet confidence of a veteran. His experiences on the ridge had changed him in ways that would last long after the war ended. Remember, he told the fresh-faced soldiers during their first briefing, "Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing what needs to be done despite the fear." The captured German positions were rapidly incorporated into the Allied defensive system. Engineers worked to reverse the firing positions and connect the elaborate tunnel network to Canadian communication lines. The ridge that had served as a German stronghold for 3 years now anchored the Allied line, its commanding heights providing observation over the entire Douai Plain. Captain MacDonald, to now Major MacDonald following battlefield promotion, established his headquarters in the same bunker where he had sheltered during the German counterattacks. The irony was not lost on him, the elaborate defensive preparations that had protected German officers now served their Canadian counterparts. The war had a way of transforming everything it touched, including the meaning of victory and defeat. The German withdrawal from Vimy Ridge marked the beginning of a broader strategic retreat. The Hindenburg Line, constructed during the winter of 1916-17, represented the enemy's admission that their forward positions were no longer tenable. The Canadian victory had demonstrated that no defensive position, however, well prepared, could withstand a properly planned and executed assault. As documented in the final dispatch from the Canadian Corps headquarters, the Battle of Vimy Ridge had proven that colonial forces could not only match but exceed the performance of their European counterparts. The victory had been achieved through superior planning, training, and execution rather than mere numerical superiority. The Canadian Corps had suffered fewer casualties, while achieving more complete success than any comparable operation in the war's history. The ridge itself became a symbol of Canadian national identity. The young Dominion that had entered the war as a collection of provinces emerged from Vimy as a unified nation forged in the crucible of combat. The shared sacrifice had created bonds between French and English Canada that would endure long after the political controversies of the war had faded. Private Chen's family in Vancouver received word of his decoration for gallantry during the battle, making him one of the first Chinese Canadians to be officially recognized for military service. His courage under fire had helped break down racial barriers that had excluded many from full participation in Canadian society. The war had accelerated social changes that might have taken decades to achieve in peacetime. The German prisoners, captured during the battle, provided valuable intelligence about enemy defensive preparations across the entire Western Front. Their detailed knowledge of the tunnel systems and artillery positions helped Allied planners develop new tactics for future operations. The victory at Vimy Ridge had not only secured a strategic position, but it also revealed the vulnerabilities of the German defensive system. Sergeant Harrison, despite his wounds, survived the war and returned to his farm in Saskatchewan. The veteran who had led men through the hell of Vimy Ridge found peace in the simple rhythms of agricultural life. His war diary, preserved in the Canadian War Museum, provides one of the most detailed accounts of the battle from the perspective of the common soldier. The memorial, erected on Hill 145, after the war became a pilgrimage site for Canadians seeking to understand their nation's sacrifice. The twin towers of the monument, visible for miles across the French countryside, stand as eternal testimony to the courage of the men who fought and died on these slopes. The names of the 11,000 Canadian soldiers who died in France, with no known grave, are carved into its base. The Battle of Vimy Ridge had lasted for days, but its impact would endure for generations. The young men who had climbed those chalk cliffs in April 1917 had not only won a battle, but had helped forge a nation. Their legacy lived on in the Canada they had died to defend, a country that had found its voice on the battlefields of the Great War.